You're listening to the Progressive Radio Network. This is Radio Free Science. My name is Celia Farber. This is a brand new show. I'm going to be joined today by a co-host. He's an old friend. He's a scientist. His name is Dr. David Raznick. And I asked him to join me and co-host the show because we're going to be talking a lot about science and politics and journalism and the nexus between all of them and how things go terribly, terribly wrong and awry and corrupted. And I felt like I wanted to have a scientist so he can talk about the scientific side and the political side. And I'll represent sort of the public. So we're gonna put our minds together here, and I'm gonna welcome right away my co-host, Dr. David Raznick. But first, let me give an introduction quickly. He worked for 20 years in the pharmaceutical biotech industry on cancer, emphysema, arthritis, and parasitic diseases, and studied AIDS for 3 decades. He has spent the last 15 years working with Peter Duesberg on the chromosomal imbalance theory of cancer, and his book, The Chromosomal Imbalance Theory of Cancer, was published this past December. Welcome, David Raznick. Are you there?
Oh, Celia, yes. It's great to be with you. I'm looking forward to it.
I am too. Boy, do we have a lot to talk about. I'm just going to bring it right down to earth here so everybody knows where we're going on the level that we're on here. I called Dave Raznick yesterday. He lives in California, and I said, Dave, can you please help me make heads or tails of this Wikileaks U.S. government HIV AIDS cable? Some of you know what I'm talking about already. I'm going to clarify in a moment. Before we go any further, Dave, do you happen to have a copy of that cable? Oh, they just gave it to me. Okay. Let's tell our listening audience what this interesting cable says, and then we're going to get right into it. Sorry, Dave, I cut you off. Welcome.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Like I say, I enjoy talking about important things.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting, fascinating, bizarre development. Here's what it is. It was late one night, and I was reading Wikileaks, and I was looking around in HIV AIDS cables, wondering if they could shed any light on all these massive confusions, to say the least, that we've all had for so many years. There's a sort of, you could say, persecuted minority of people who don't think the government has been right about HIV AIDS. And that's as mildly as I can put it. The cable I found is titled Final Rule in the Federal Register that will remove HIV infection from the list of communicable diseases of public health significance and remove references to HIV from the scope of medical examination for aliens. So what the breakaway quote from this that is just, it's in our tweezers here, and that's what we're trying to make heads or tails of. I'm just going to read it, and then we're going to talk about it for the full hour. The CDC determined that while HIV infection is a serious health condition, it is not a communicable disease that is a significant public health risk for introduction, transmission, and spread through casual contact. We refer you to the CDC for further guidance. Now, some people are saying, wow, that's very big news indeed. That's kind of mind-blowing and shattering. Others are saying, old hat, old news. We've known that for a long time. Dave Raznick, what was your response when you read that?
Well, the CDC, there's no doubt about it, going all the way back to the late 80s, early 90s, they said that you could not acquire AIDS casually. So that's true. There's nothing new about that. But what is new is that they're taking this, of the 8 diseases that can prohibit people from entering the United States, HIV used to be one of them if you consider it a disease, and 6 of those 8 are actually sexually transmitted. But HIV is the only one that is lethal. There's no cure for it, and that sort of thing. It's certainly qualifies as a significant public health risk. At least that's what the CDC, the WHO, the Department of Health and Human Services, all these other people have been telling us for at least 25 years, at least a quarter of a century. And so it came as a real shock to me to see this WikiLeaks thing. And you found it, and I was really curious how you must have found it, because why isn't this a headline someplace? Why wasn't it a headline in 2010 when that final report, final rule became law? That's what I wanted to know. And
well, exactly. Why isn't it? Why didn't it? Yeah, I mean, there is no question that we've got major cognitive dissonance here. A wild gulf between what has been consistent propaganda for how many years? 26, 27?
At least a quarter century.
Yeah. And this very kind of quiet, sober, laconic cable, as if it's nothing, saying, HIV. Actually, the exact wording is interesting. HIV infection. They don't say AIDS. They don't say HIV disease. They say HIV infection. So, as I've said many times in my writings, we're all trapped, first of all, in a language that was created by the people who created the confusion. So sometimes we're going to break out of that language. But let's go back to, okay, in 1990, the U.S. government, to the dismay, the political dismay of the rest of the world, European civilized countries, the U.S. government said nobody can come into the United States if they are known to be HIV positive, and anybody seeking to enter the United States on a more than a tourist visa needs to be tested. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that happened in 1990, and then they reversed it as of this cable in 2010, and they said HIV is not a communicable disease of any public health significance, and nobody needs to get tested for it. In plain language, that's what happened.
Right. I've been living in California since 1980, and I remember the 1990 AIDS conference, International AIDS Conference. It was held in San Francisco in 1990. And that was the last year that the International AIDS Conference was hosted by the United States. And the reason for that was this rule, this federal rule that prohibited HIV-positive people from coming into the United States. The organizers of the conference refused to hold any more conferences in the USA because of that rule. So, I mean, it certainly had a significant effect, and it was important enough for international bodies to react to it. Now, the questions I had, why did the CDC do this, and why do they do it now? I went to the CDC's website, and believe me, it's if I didn't have this cable that Celia dug up, I wouldn't have known about it, and I wouldn't have even known how to track it. But because of some interesting terms in there, I was able to track it down on the CDC's website to find out what was their rationale, what was the basis for them removing HIV, the world's greatest, deadliest sexually transmitted plague, from this list. And here's all they say. The CDC said it was taking this action to revert the CDC was taking this action to reflect current scientific knowledge and public health best practices and to reduce stigmatization of people who are HIV infected. All right, but they don't tell us what this current scientific knowledge is or public health best practices. That's just sort of a very, I guess they had to give some sort of justification, and most people, whatever the CDC says or the Department of Allergy and Infectious Disease, whatever they say, people just swallow it and don't ask any questions.
Well, so clearly they are, they're trying to slip a kind of a herd of elephants through the living room without anybody noticing. And we are noticing because we we've been called insane for a quarter of a century for saying these kinds of things. So hang on a minute. What we're calling it, is not spreading. It's, that's in the Western world. It's exploding in Africa. Well, really? Why? Why did it move to Africa, and why is it so vengeful in Africa and not in the Western world? I mean, the whole thing has been bananas. And so now we have an undetonated bomb, I would say, and we're trying to detonate it.
Yeah, and it's the CDC built the bomb. And Celia, could you tell us a little bit more about how it was that you came across this? Were you just scanning Wikileaks, searching it? It's not so easy to come by this information.
Well, WikiLeaks, I'm fascinated by WikiLeaks, and I actually only recently realized, hey, you can go there and read stuff. And I did, I plugged in HIV/AIDS into the, it's a dossier of documents called Cablegate. I don't know the number, how many, but it's a whole lot, and it's U.S. Embassy, U.S. diplomatic cables. And I plugged in HIV/AIDS, and I sat there for hours, motionless, and I scrolled through them all, and there were actually about 10 that I downloaded. We're gonna have some more fun in the coming weeks. But this one was the most stunning. And I saw first I thought it meant that the U.S. government was calling HIV infection, quote, not a communicable disease. And then I realized, no, it says not a communicable disease that is of significant public health risk. So let's stop right there. You know, I like to be very fair. I don't want to overstate things. But for God's sake, we have been told, I have a stack of books here. I don't know where to begin reading the scare quotes, but I'm just going to pull a few from memory. Oprah Winfrey, I think, predicted that 90 million Americans could be dead from AIDS by 1990, or 70 million, something like that. There was one global AIDS expert, American, I believe, and I quoted her in my book, but I couldn't find my own book before coming here. And she said, and I'm paraphrasing, that AIDS could kill more Americans than exist. We could kill more people than we even have people if we let it go. And I called Dave before the show and I said, do you have my book? Can you find that quote? Did you find it?
No, I have your book, and I've been looking through it. And I can't find it.
Okay. We'll get to that next time. But nobody would disagree that the propaganda has been. I can't even wrap my arms around. There's no way I can describe that. Nobody can describe the propaganda. It was so overwhelming. It was so crushing. It was so, if you even dared think the thought, never mind say it, never mind print it. Never mind printed in a scientific journal. Hang on a minute. The infectiousness of this is not what you all are saying. I remember when that was enough to make, literally this happened at Spin Magazine where I was a reporter at the time. It made the staff cry. It made our publicist cry. It made the fact checkers cry. One of them, I came into the back room there, and there were all the staff who basically hated that column were glowering at me and huddled around a fact checker, and she had to call the CDC from Spin Magazine and say, you know, our column on AIDS this month says that you're not right about this and that, and you said this and that, and it was traumatic for people because it didn't matter if it was true. It was just, if you were a good person, this is what you said, that HIV/AIDS was exploding, spreading, anybody could get it, every sexual encounter unprotected was Russian roulette. And, this is settled. They're done on this. The question is, what do we, let's just call ourselves the American taxpayers, what are we owed when they, I know what they're going to do now, by the way. They're going to say, and they're already saying it, well, we've been saying that for a long time, to which I say, how dare you? How dare you not even have a single mea culpa. A real mea culpa is what the world deserves. I'm kind of on my soapbox now. Let's talk facts.
Well, you know what I wish we could do? It was too short a notice, really, but the CDC should be held accountable for this. I wish we could interview somebody from the CDC. I looked to their website here, and they say if you want any more information about this final rule, they give a phone number. You know?
Do they really?
They do, and I can give it to you if you want to call them up and see if we can't get anybody there. The website is the CDC.
I'll tell you right now, we're not going to get anybody by the end of this hour. By the way, I was told by the National Cancer Institute before there were all these divisions for AIDS, I was told that I was permanently stricken from the register of journalists who would have any access to any U.S. government scientist ever again after I interviewed Peter Duesberg in Spin in 1987. It was published in 1988. So, I don't think my chances are that good. You call them. Okay. I wanted to share some of the amazing statistics that you dug up when I asked you to write a one-page kind of fact sheet on this. And you're so good with so many things, including the dollars and the numbers. So I'm just going to read from your report that I got today. U.S. taxpayers have spent $3.1 billion on AIDS. In the year 1990. We are still spending $28 billion this year, and cumulatively since 1981, we have spent $344 billion on AIDS. That's mysterious. The whole thing is mysterious.
Goes up every year.
How on earth? I mean, so the question is, what is the nature of the racket? What is the scam? What are they doing? And what can we do about it? Except what we're doing right now. I mean,
grassroots discourse. The fact, look at it this way. I always think that if you have somebody as powerful as the federal government of the United States, and they're going to the trouble to exclude a journalist, you, for example, to have any contact or to with any of the government agencies, certainly about this AIDS stuff, to basically defund Peter Duesberg, a single professor at University of California, Berkeley, intimidate the president of South Africa for daring to ask questions about the assertions from the AIDS establishment. I tell you, I've known this for many, many years, that the AIDS establishment, and I mean going all the way up to Anthony Fauci, the director of Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, have known for a long, long time, at least 2 decades, that they've got it wrong. Everything they said about AIDS, they've got it wrong. Now, if that's true, then what would it do? First of all, their careers would be terminated. They would just be sloughed off and somebody else would take the job. That's one thing. But the federal government, think of the consequences to the institutions of the federal government if it turned out that even some of the things they've said over the past quarter century about AIDS were wrong. And I'm certain all of them are wrong.
Well, yeah, wrong goes all the way back to, does an entity exist that has come to be known as HIV. Let's put that in quotation marks. That's for future shows. We're going to get to that. I promise. It goes all the way down to that level. Did they purify, isolate anything cogent? Let's just start and say that there is an it of a set of proteins that they're calling a retrovirus. The two questions that you and I agree are indelibly entwined: the spread of a disease and the cause of a disease, right?
Right.
Okay. But a lot of people who are on the side of the so-called angels in the media, good people, say, well, they exaggerated the spread of AIDS and they exaggerated how HIV can spread. Yeah, they went a little too far, but they were really just trying to protect us. But that doesn't mean that HIV doesn't cause it. Tell us a little bit in your mind, how how can we best think about all these debates? What is the relationship between spread and cause in epidemiology?
Well, I would go back even more fundamental than talking about a virus. I would go back to the very beginning. You have this thing called AIDS. Now it's up to about 26 or some odd diseases that have nothing to do with each other, basically. But that's part of the clinical definition of AIDS for survey purposes mostly, but unfortunately they actually diagnose people using those survey definitions. But the notion that AIDS is a contagious disease, a communicable disease, a disease caused by an infectious agent. Forget about what the infectious agent is. It is never, I cannot find a single, over the years, a single or even a group of scientific papers that have even addressed the question, is AIDS a contagious or communicable disease? It was axiomatic as of April 23rd, 1984, that AIDS was a contagious disease caused by an infectious agent that came to be known as HIV. It was only declared to be a contagious disease. So most people start from that point on, and then that's why you get hung up on this HIV and everything, because the contagiousness, sexual transmission and everything all started with the idea that HIV was the cause of AIDS. But prior to 1984, it was even clear, before that April 23rd, 1984, it was very clear, and clear to this day, that AIDS is not even a contagious disease. In other words, you cannot catch AIDS from another human being. You could no more catch AIDS from another human being than you could catch lung cancer from another human being. You know, you just can't do it. There's something else going on.
AIDS, bottom line, AIDS is not infectious. It is acquired.
Yeah, it's acquired. It definitely is acquired. I don't dispute that. But so is alcoholism. You know, so is lung cancer. For most people, it's acquired. Decades of cigarette smoking and things like that. But it's not a contagious thing. You cannot spread it that way. And all of the epidemiology of AIDS is absolutely convincing. I mean, there's no shred of doubt about it that it's not spreading as a contagious disease, which goes up exponentially over time. We have been told since 1985, it might even be as early as 1984, that 1 million Americans are infected with HIV. We've been told that every year since 1984, including up through 2011. I think this year, 2012,
I think they actually lowered that one. I think it was at 1.5 at one point, and they lowered it.
I think that might have been 84. I think when they first did it, and then they brought it down, I think maybe the next year to like 1 million. And then sometimes they'll say it's 900,000.
But that's been a consistent figure.
Constant.
Right.
Constant. And I have references to every year, including going all the way back to 1985, where the CDC has said 1 million Americans are HIV positive. Now, you cannot have an infectious disease that stays constant, you know, for a quarter century. It just, plus you can't have an infectious disease that knows whether you're gay or straight, white or black, rich or poor, or what zip code you live in. but AIDS is that way. You know,
let me ask you this: can you have an infectious disease? Can you have a sexually transmissible disease, an STD, that is just kind of a little bit not really infectious?
I don't know of one. I can't think of it. I mean, like I say, that list of diseases, those 8 diseases that the CDC lists that exclude people from coming into the United States, I can read them.
Yeah, please do. Please read those. And tell us again what exactly you're reading. Just
right. I'm reading from the federal, what's it called? The federal something regulations. They call it CFR, 42 CFR Part 34. That was that legislation, or that rule, that law, that allowed the CDC to prohibit people from coming into the country if they have some of these considerably significant public health risk diseases. Okay, so
and for this has been in place for a few decades. This list of sexually transmissible diseases. Okay, so this is the list of sexually transmissible diseases that you cannot come into the United States if you have any of these, and they are considered significant.
Right, there's 8 here, and 6 of those 8 are, according to the CD, sexually transmitted. Cancroids. I went to the CDC's own website and confirmed all of these, and they're sexually transmitted. Cancroid, Gonorrhea, of course, gonorrhea, most people have heard of that. Granuloma inguinale, I guess. I don't know how you pronounce that one. I've never seen it before. That's sexually transmitted. They say HIV is sexually transmitted. That was on the list. Leprosy, now, I don't know I don't consider that sexually transmitted, but that's one of the ones on the list. Then they have lymphogranuloma venereum. That's sexually transmitted disease. Syphilis is sexually transmitted, and tuberculosis, which I don't believe is sexually transmitted. You normally get it through your lungs and things like that. But the interesting thing of it is that these except for the sexually transmitted diseases, neither leprosy nor tuberculosis is really that communicable. Doctors, for example, do not get leprosy or tuberculosis from treating lepers or people with TB. They don't. So both of those are diseases of poverty and malnutrition. So you can call them a communicable disease if you want to. A population of malnourished poor people, they can certainly spread this stuff around. But healthy people with a functioning immune system and a good diet and everything, they don't come down with either leprosy or tuberculosis. Those are third world diseases, basically, for poor people. So,
fascinating.
And the only one on that list that is considered 100% fatal and is primarily sexually transmitted, and there's no cure for it, is HIV.
Right, so it's a big deal that they struck it off, in other words.
That should have been the last one.
Right. Exactly.
If you believe the rhetoric, it would be the most deadly or significant public health risk of all the communicable diseases. If you believe their own rhetoric.
You know what I think? I think this is an immigration story that came across my windshield and now yours and many people's as an AIDS story. In other words, it has something to do with the politics of immigration, and I think they just, because nobody was listening, they went ahead with this for reasons that have to do with immigration laws that none of us can say anything about because we don't know anything about it. But they did this for some reason that I don't think had to do with, it's really high time we admit we were wrong about HIV and AIDS.
No, they didn't do it for that. In fact, that's why they've kept it pretty silent. If it weren't for your diligence at looking through that Wikileaks stuff, I wouldn't have known about it. I don't know if anybody would have known about it.
Well, we have to thank Mr. Julian Assange for that. This is a whole new era. I just want to say I believe that Wikileaks has totally split this culture, split the media into before and after, and we're now in the after age where and all journalists know this. What you really want, and what is so hard, if not impossible, to get, is the stuff they say to each other that they don't think you're ever gonna read or hear. I saw that exact phenomenon at those. Remember those AIDS Gordon conferences they used to have, HIV AIDS Gordon conferences on proteases? Yes.
All those years ago, I went to a couple of them. Yeah, they don't do those anymore. But I was absolutely shocked by what those people would admit in a group of other colleagues. That's absolutely opposite of what they tell the public. About how harmless. I didn't use that word. But how very difficult it is to get AIDS, and to spread HIV. They'll say that, in the conferences.
Speaking of the public, you can call us. Join the conversation. We want to talk to you. 888. Actually, here's the number. I know. Isn't this fun? 888-874-4888. I'll give that again. Toll-free number, 888-874-4888. If we're lucky, we're going to have Dr. Nancy Turner Banks, author of AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire, with us in the second half of the show. Not sure whether we've reached her, but if not, then we'll certainly have her on the next show. She's definitely agreed to come on the show, but sometimes there are communication breakdowns, and I hope it wasn't my fault. We're very eager to talk to her. Anyway, okay, we're going to go to a little break, and we're going to come back and keep talking about the explosive Wikileaks cable. U.S. government ceases HIV testing visa applicants, calls HIV infection not a communicable disease of significant public health risk. This is Progressive Radio Network. We'll be right back. I'm Celia Farber. You're listening to Radio Free Science on Progressive Radio Network. My co-host is Dr. David Raznick. He's been studying AIDS for 30 years. It's 30 years of head scratching. I've been studying AIDS for 26 years. So between us, we feel qualified to say that we think that some big news broke this week. We've got something in our tweezers, and for those who are just tuning in, I'm going to tell you again what it is. God bless WikiLeaks. God bless Julian Assange. Now, WikiLeaks gives us raw data information, the kind we love, the kind that nobody wanted us to get. What it doesn't do is tell us what it means. That's our job. Here's what I found on WikiLeaks a few days ago. It's a cable from the Office of the Secretary of State dated December 16th, 2009, published as part of what WikiLeaks is calling Cablegate, and it states that on November 2nd, HHS CDC published a, quote, final rule in the Federal Register that will remove HIV infection from the list of communicable diseases of public health significance and remove references to HIV from the scope of medical examinations for aliens. The final rule went into effect on January 4th, 2010, which ended reversed a 20-year standing law which held that you could not come into the United States if you were HIV positive. That's fine. They're allowed to change laws. They're allowed to make dumb laws smarter and crude laws more refined. We're not going to jump on them for changing a law. But as they changed this law, they let out some language that we find really interesting. Let me read the pull quote, what in the old world, in the old media magazine days we used to call pull quote. The CDC determined that while HIV infection is a serious health condition, it is not a communicable disease that is a significant public health risk for introduction, transmission, and spread through casual contact. We refer you to the CDC for further guidance. Now, many people will say, well, but we know that. We've always known that, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of apologia. But what we have here is a massive, catastrophic history of people who have been trying to state the obvious, point to the elephant, 2 + 2 = 4, trying to just do what scientists do what journalists do what epidemiologists do. Those people were not only impeded and attacked, fired, crushed, sabotaged in their careers, they were also literally, and I'm one of them, called insane. The word is AIDS denialist. Now, by the way, you can question, AIDS denialist is a relatively new form of hate speech. It came into full swing sometime, I want to say after 2004 or 5. In the early days of this battle, they called us all kinds of ugly words, but it wasn't until they came up with that, I have to say, demonically brilliant term of derision, AIDS denialist, because it's all baked in there. This is a person who denies reality. This is a person who's crazy, doesn't know how. If you don't know how to recognize reality, you are crazy. If I hold up 2 fingers and you see 3, you're crazy. So So we've been crazy for a long time. We've been punished severely in ways that we're going to talk about on this show, what they did to people, what they did to scientists, what they did to journalists, what they did to individuals, citizens, HIV-positive people who didn't believe all this, who were relentlessly persecuted. There's a lot here that we are not ready to shrug this off and say, okay, well, anyway, that was then, this is now. Dave Raznick, welcome. Are you there?
I am here.
Welcome back, I should say.
Yeah. Did you get Nancy by any chance?
Nancy's not with us yet, and all I can say is I promise everybody she's going to be here with us because I wrote to her and she's happy to come on the show. And again, I suspect it may be my fault. I don't know. You know, there's a lot of emailing back and forth with numbers and Skype and everything. I apologize if it's my fault, but we'll get her next time. I want to read a... Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Dave.
I'd like to encourage, I thought about this during the break, I'd like to encourage anybody out there who's listening, if they knew about this before we did and how they found out about this, I guess...
Great point.
Removing HIV from this dire list of diseases that exclude people from entering the United States. Sure, I know people must know about it, but it's been a big secret, and it's not like Celia and I don't look at this stuff a lot. You know, I've certainly not heard it before Wednesday, and there's an awful lot of people I know out there who've been following things like this, and I think it's fresh information myself.
Yeah, well, there. By the way, the number again, toll free 888-874-4888. Like I said, we've got this interesting cable from Wikileaks in our tweezers, and we are trying to figure out what it means. We don't know exactly what it means. It's very strange. We don't know why now. We don't know what the repercussions of this may have been for, you know, if there were people inside the government who had to fight for this. This must have something to do with our president, Barack Obama. He's the president. He has also been cutting global AIDS funding, which hasn't made him popular among AIDS activists. They've been angry, but they haven't been the kind of angry that they can get, that they have been toward many of us. When they get angry, you don't have a job anymore. They haven't gotten that kind of angry at Barack Obama. So there's something going on here, and it's political. We're going to try to get people to this show who know something about the inner machinations of government. But meanwhile, we're talking about the epidemiological and scientific side of this. I don't like the word scientific. Dave, we were talking yesterday about what's happened to science. Let's just pull back a little bit. How many years? I know you studied AIDS for 30 years. Yeah. How many years have you been a scientist?
I've been a practicing, productive, I like to think, scientist since 1978 when I got my PhD. I've seen it. Fortunately, I'm old enough that in the field that I was in, proteases, and I'm a chemist, and I grew up and matured as a scientist at a time and in a field that wasn't really dominated by money and political considerations. It was a lot of fun. You could go to these conferences. They were very dynamic. They weren't terribly large, although some of them could be. And there was a free-flowing exchange of ideas. And people were free to talk, and it would get heated, but then after it was over with, it was no problem. You didn't hate the person. You'd go out and have a beer with them. It's just part of the game. It's like an athletic event, you know, and you really enjoyed what you were doing. And now from the 80s, you know, into the 80s, certainly in the latter half of the 80s, second half of the 80s, with this AIDS stuff, I had experienced firsthand living in California and collaborating with a number of people at University of California, San Francisco on a number of things. And, of course, AIDS was a big deal out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that's when I first came across a group of people, or a subject, a topic that was totally taboo, and that was AIDS. among scientists. That never happened in my experience prior to that. I lost friends by just wanting to talk about it and raise questions. And there was one fellow I collaborated with for a number of years in parasites, and we both agreed mutually that to not talk about AIDS because we wanted to continue our collaboration, and we didn't want to jeopardize that. Now that's unheard of in science, but I'm afraid it's very common now. People aren't nearly as free to discuss things, and basically freedom of speech is dead in science. It's gone. All you have to do is talk to Wakefield and Jeff Schmidt, a whole bunch of other people, Halton Arp, and a number of other people that I've met, first-rate scientists. And science is the money that's involved in science now, the billions of dollars, has turned it into something else, a monster that has really little, if anything, to do with a free and open discourse and pursuit of whatever you want to do. It just doesn't exist. The only reason that I think I'm pretty sure that the reason that Peter Duesberg and I were able to reinvestigate this 100-year-old theory about the chromosomal imbalance theory of cancer was because we were not beholden to anybody. We couldn't get any funding from anybody. So we were free. Nobody could tell us what we could do and what we couldn't do. So it looks like right now, in order to really do interesting, innovative work in science, you have to be unfunded or barely funded and not connected with any organization.
You know, it sounds very familiar. The same thing has happened to my beloved profession, the media. I can't say it is money. It's just not as obvious as it is in science, but freedom of thought, freedom of speech. Journalism is dead. The media, like science, I mean, scientists and journalists are linked on the same necklace of impulses, people who want to find out what is really going on. And that very impulse has become so despised and persecuted in both of our professions. It's literally surreal. It's to use the obvious word, it's Orwellian. It's truly Orwellian.
And I think it's systemic. I think it goes throughout society. And the thing is that the institutions of society right now seem to be just kind of grinding to a halt or just kind of falling apart wherever you look. AIDS was one of the first clear examples to me. The institutions of health in the United States, the Department of Health and Human Services, the National Institutes of Health, it was very clear that it was coming unraveled. I mean, the only thing that kept it alive was like the Soviet Union, money. People just refused to let it go. But if people eventually, I guess Gorbachev and the others just decided not to hang on to it, and then it just fell apart all on its own. And I think that's what is eventually going to happen, certainly in the United States, institutions such as National Institutes of Health and other places, in the AIDS stuff, is that at some point, some people are just going to lose interest in keeping this monstrosity alive, and it will just unravel almost overnight once the money stops.
Well, we're going to keep talking about this, and we'll see if this could be maybe our Berlin Wall moment. I'm going to read a quote. I found I became interested. I remembered the name Bruce Charlton a few weeks ago, and I said, "Hey, yeah, there was this." Speaking of persecution and fascism, he was the editor of a very open-minded journal that unfortunately was in the Elsevier stable, and it was called Medical Hypothesis. This deserves at least one show in the future. That whole episode. There was a paper that was published, Dave, I believe you were co-author, right, with Peter Duesberg and others, and right. We won't get into that now, but it had to do with South Africa, it had to do with AIDS, HIV, deaths and numbers, primarily. Am I right so far, Dave?
Yeah. And the drug could have prevented these deaths, that sort of thing.
You were addressing the outrageous accusation that was going around the media I forget who started it, saying that Peter Duesberg, Thabo Mbeki had former President Thabo Mbeki had killed 300,000 people by withholding ARVs.
By paying attention to Peter Duesberg, following his advice and stuff like that, and so they basically accused in a major scientific journal Peter Duesberg and Thabo Mbeki of murder.
Right.
And that paper was eventually, and they would not, that journal, I forget which one it was now, it was a while back. Normally journals, when you mention somebody by name, it's usually, you're allowed the opportunity to at least write a letter to the editor in response, and of course the journal refused to do that. So then we went off and eventually got the response published in Medical Hypotheses, and it was published. And then some South African AIDS activist groups joined up with some others to put pressure on, was it Elsevier? Was they ultimately the
Absolutely
publisher?
It was.
Medical Hypotheses, to kill it, to pull the paper from Medical Hypotheses, and then they made a big deal about that, and also to put pressure on the University of California, Berkeley, to bring charges against Peter Duesberg, charges of scientific misconduct, which he was totally
which he was cleared of. Totally exonerated after enormous cost and headache and trauma. These people have gotten away with such terrible things. Anyway, please continue.
Yeah, and another one of another author had a completely different paper from ours, an Italian, Marco Ruggiero. He is now facing a very similar situation, and I understand in the next issue or two of either Nature, I think it's Nature, is going to have a similar diatribe against him. And he's already experiencing pressure at his university where he is in Italy. So this thing is global.
Let's talk about this for a moment. I'm gonna read a quote from Bruce. Okay, Bruce Charlton was the editor of Medical Hypothesis during all this, and he acted very honorably and very, very courageously. He did not denounce the authors or turn his back on the paper, and he was fired. And if I'm not mistaken, the journal itself was crushed, just eliminated.
No, it still exists. But now
is that right? Okay.
They've added peer review and brought in the toady editor.
Okay, there you go. Yeah. Well, this is one of the most brilliant quotes I've ever read about the state of modern science. It's actually called. It's a short little piece from his blog. It's titled, "What is Modern Freedom?" Quote from Bruce Charlton: "It is the freedom to doubt the reality of what has been regarded as good, then to doubt the possibility of good, then to subvert, invert, destroy, reform the good in the name of the better. Unconstrained freedom to attack the good is now regarded as the most important of all human rights. Yet, since the good is reality, this means that the ultimate modern freedom, defended with the full force of the modern state and mass media, is the right to deny reality. A short term for the denial of reality is psychoticism. Thus, modern freedom is a freedom to be psychotic, and an unconditional right to have this delusional state defended by all necessary means."
I would say that's true system-wide. The only place where I think there's hope, and I see it all the time, is in the grassroots. The institutional people, the big shots, people with MDs, PhDs, all that sort of thing, people that big magnates of the media, people that have power, as we normally conceive power, they're all in cahoots in this thing, and they're guilty and corrupt. But the grassroots people, regular everyday people, I don't see that corruption. I see a lot of hope there. They're fighting back. They're fighting against all this insanity of vaccinations. There's over 30 vaccines a child in California has to endure in order to go to public school. And families are resisting that and fighting it's insane. We truly are living in an insane world.
We are.
I think institutional society is psychotic.
That's why I love that quote so much, and that's the starting point of this program. We're living in a psychotic world, and we're not psychotic, and we're all going to start talking to each other and trying to help each other. Really, I mean, I want to reach out to Professor Ruggiero and say, what exactly are they trying to do to you, and how can we support you? Because the whole game is isolate. And then exert psychological brutality and torture. Unfortunately for them, Peter Duisberg, who was their main object of obsession and persecution in this AIDS history, this AIDS story, which now stretches a quarter of a century, boy, has he been tenacious, enduring, and courageous. But what was unfortunate for them about him was that he was not really, you couldn't really crack him psychologically. And I know this from first,
tried.
Right? They tried and they tried and they tried.
Yeah.
There's just something about Peter Duisberg's fundamental disposition. He's not, vulnerable in the way that they would be vulnerable. They would be extremely vulnerable if you took away all the goodies. You took away the funding and the fame
right.
and the glory and the prizes. And he just wants to keep doing his work.
Well, if Peter hadn't already been elevated to full professor before he started criticizing AIDS, he'd be gone now. He would not be on the radar at all. So in a way, he was lucky that at least his livelihood. That's about all they left him, because they can't kick him out of UC Berkeley if he hasn't broken any laws or anything like that. But they don't let him teach anything. But he hasn't taught graduate students, I think, since the 1980s. He doesn't have any graduate students. He can't really do anything there. He has no grant support or anything, but yet he's still there, and he's still churning out the cancer work and everything. But it's for two reasons. First of all, who he is as a human being. He has a tremendous sense of humor, which I think is absolutely essential to survive this stuff. And he's a man of extreme integrity. And he was a full professor before all this started happening. I noticed early on about the dissidents, the AIDS dissidents, the ones that spoke out publicly were either retired or Nobel laureates or something like that, emeritus professors who their careers could not be terminated. But you didn't see too many people. One of the reasons why I was able to speak out openly is because I had my own business, my own companies. I couldn't be fired. But I've paid prices too, but not nearly as dear as
I know you have. We're going to talk about all of it on this show, Radio Free Science. We're here every Friday. We're not leaving yet, but we got to go in a few minutes. Every
Friday. Is there a website? Is there a website for your program?
Not yet. There's progressiveradionetwork.com. Oh, sorry, prn.fm. prn.fm. And my website is truthbarrier.com. I want to quickly say thank you to a Mr. Andy Lindsay in Edinburgh, Scotland, who's been helping me behind the scenes just make heads or tails of this. Andy, thank you. We love you, and stay on it and help us. We'll keep talking about this and tell us what you find. Everybody else out there, this is a collective laboratory experiment trying to get to the bottom of what this cable may mean. We're not going to totally obsess about it, but we are going to return to it. So do stay in touch with us, and do come back next week. Every Friday, 3 p.m., Radio Free Science, and I'll be joined again next week by my friend and co-host David Raznick, Dr. David Raznick. This is the Progressive Radio Network, and I hope you will come to truthbarrier.com, read the cable, tell me what you think. Tell me what you think.